attractions. In February, Judge Vaudrey, who's here tonight, will be back to talk about Truman's role in, not Truman, MacArthur's role. You talked about that last year. MacArthur's role in Japan between 1945 and 1950, when he was basically, the Japanese would call him the shogun of Japan, running everything. And then looking ahead to March, we're going to talk about the most important battle of World War II. Does anybody want to take a guess on what that was? What was the most, yes? Midway.
Kursk.
Midway. Kursk, nice try, no cigar.
Bulge. And Bulge?
Nope, we did that last year in December. Anybody?
Iwo Jima?
Nope.
You're all right, by the way.
How about the Battle of the North Atlantic? The only thing that Winston Churchill said kept him up at night was worrying about whether that would be won or not, because if we hadn't won it, none of those other battles happened. So that'll be March, okay? So that's the next 3 months. The other thing I wanted to emphasize was this is a library program, and one of the things that when we got together to connive this operation was we wanted it to be something where people could feel like they could be involved and participate and contribute. So if you've got something that you'd like to talk about, like back in October when Chris Howard was here and he talked about the Battle of Hurricane Forest, he wanted to do that because his dad was there and got hurt and spent the rest of his life dealing with it. So, you know, if you've got something like that you want to talk about, I mean, when we did tanks earlier this year, we had one fellow come in with all his model tanks, and another fellow that driven a tank was here, and then I happened to run into a guy who actually made armor plate for tanks. So, you know, we had a nice group, and that's kind of what we're looking for. So, you know, if you want to be involved, let us know. If you don't want to do a full presentation or something, but maybe you'd like to be part of it, let us know. And that brings me to my next point, because in the last 2 meetings, people said, hey, I've got something when you want to do World War I. I gave them my card and said, send me an email, and I never got anything from them. So if you're out there, yes?
That was me.
Letter?
Yeah.
Okay, we need to talk after this, okay? And there's another fellow that's got a bunch of World War I relics, okay? So definitely I'd like to talk to you before January, okay? All right.
Steve?
Steve?
Yeah.
Also, just want before we'll have something out here before you leave. We have a specific World War Forum distribution list. So if you want an email that is specific related to this program, so you know what, you know, reminder about the next one, but also a list of the upcoming programs for at least the next 3 to 6 months. You can get that email. Just leave your name and email address on that sheet, and we'll add you to the list.
I don't have to say that now, so thank you. Okay, good. Okay, so tonight we're going to follow up kind of on our first presentation 2 years ago, which was on Pearl Harbor, and we did it on December 7th, so that's why we meet on Tuesdays. Tonight we're going to talk about the man who helped make sure that America bounced back from that disaster and did more to win World War II maybe than anybody else, and then did as much to help it secure a peace after the war. Our presenter tonight is Dan Zeiser. It says here he's a Cleveland area lawyer.
That is true.
Had us all fooled, Dan. Anyways, he specializes in employment and labor law. He's a friend of mine. He's a member of the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable, a past president, huzzah, and a major contributor to its success over the years. And when I asked him if he'd like to do something, and he's a big fan of George Thomas, the Civil War general, I said, well, we don't do the Civil War. So he decided to do another George, which would be George Marshall, which we'll hear tonight. So without further ado, Dan, thanks for being here. And,
Thanks, Steve. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's my honor to speak with you. Thanks to the fellow roundtable members. I see a handful of you here. And thanks to Steve, it was more a roping me into doing this. As I mentioned, I had an interest in George Marshall, but thank you for doing that. And so let's talk about George Marshall. This is one of my favorite quotes about Marshall. It's from Mark Perry, the author of Partners in Command, George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower in War and Peace. An undistinguished boy from a modest family. Born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, nothing in General Marshall's background would point to his becoming the United States' premier military officer and then a statesman. Beginning in 1902, he rose through the ranks to become Chief of Staff. He never commanded troops in combat, but became the Army's premier combat planner, and then the architect of the Allied victory in World War II. Besides his life, my presentation will focus on Marshall's vision, both from a military and political viewpoint. As I hope to show, George Marshall was peerless, certainly in the former, perhaps in the latter. He was the right man in the right place at the right time. Without him, World War II and its aftermath would likely look much different. So he's born December 31, New Year's Eve, 1880 in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, town of 3,265 according to the 1880 census. I couldn't find a photograph from the 1880s, but the one on the left is probably fairly close to what Uniontown looked like at the time. The right photo is a modern view. As you see, it's about 50 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, near the Fort Necessity battlefield. The courthouse, that's the photo on the right, was built between 1890 and 1892. So Marshall would have been familiar with it in his childhood. Marshall's parents were George Catlett Marshall Sr., of course, and Laura Emily Bradford. Both families had Virginia roots via Kentucky. Chief Justice John Marshall was a first cousin thrice removed. George Jr. was the youngest of three, brother and a sister. Not much is known about his sister, who was 4 years older than him. A little bit more is known about the brother, Stuart. George Sr. was in the coke and coal business, which was booming in southwest Pennsylvania in the 1880s. So the family was fairly well-to-do, at least until he sold the business for $125,000 in 1890. That would be over $3 million today. He invested it in a Shenandoah Valley land deal that collapsed, and then the family experienced some financial problems after. They weren't, destitute, poor by any means, but they were no longer, the well-to-do family they had been. In fact, George's mother paid for his education by selling land she owned in Kentucky. Marshall attended VMI from 1897 to 1901, where he majored in civil engineering, joined the Kappa Alpha fraternity, and played football as a left tackle, all of 145 pounds. He earned all Southern honors in 1900. He was not terribly good academically, but he was first in discipline always. He became first captain, the highest rank. Marshall's brother Stuart had attended VMI, and George was such an undistinguished student that when he knew he couldn't get into West Point, for one thing, Republicans controlled that part of Pennsylvania, and he didn't have connections in the Republican Party, so VMI, he thought, would be a suitable substitute to get into the military. But his older brother argued against sending him there because he thought it would sully the family name, the Marshall name. And George overheard Stewart telling his mother that, and that was the catalyst he needed. And he often said that was, you know, what propelled me. He wanted to show everybody. So George graduates 15th out of 34 in 1901. As I mentioned, he's average academically, but always first in discipline. I love this quote here. It's what I learned at, pardon me, what I learned at EMI was self-control, discipline, so that it was ground in. I learned also the problem of managing men. We will certainly see that later in life. So he's commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army on February 3rd, 1901. For that year after he graduated from VMI, he taught at the Danville Military Academy, I believe it was. Within days before he ships out to the Philippines, he married Elizabeth Coles of Lexington, where VMI is. She was 6 years older than he was, 26, when they met. The story goes that she was an accomplished piano player. He would walk past the house near campus, and he heard her playing piano, and would stop, frequently looked in the window. At times today he'd be arrested, but that's how they met, and they were married. 1902. Marshall always fudged about her age. I assume it was just traditional, she being that much older than him at the time, that he did not want to, that to be all that well known. Elizabeth had been courted by others, 26. Was relatively old to be married in that time. She had been courted by a number of people, including Marshall's brother Stewart, and apparently when they were getting married, Stewart made some unkind remarks, or some remarks that George found to be unkind, so he did not invite him to the wedding. Elizabeth had some kind of heart condition. I read one source that had it diagnosed. I don't think that it was never diagnosed at the time. I think it's one of those things, someone looking back at symptoms trying to diagnose it. But it was a fairly serious heart condition. She was never in great health. They never had children. You can see the series of assignments he had here on the slide. He was promoted to captain just before World War I. But from 1902 to 1917, Marshall held nearly every staff job in the Army, from staff assistant to supply officer to paymaster to trainer and to instructor. He gained a reputation as a meticulous performer. One of his commanding generals wrote in an evaluation, in an answer to whether he would like to have Marshall serve under him again, that then Captain Marshall should be made a general, and he would be glad to serve under Marshall. Everybody hearing me okay? Yeah. Okay. I have never been accused of being too quiet, so. World War I. He's first assigned to the 1st Division as Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations, G3, then to the American Expeditionary Force headquarters. There's a story that when Pershing visited 1st Division headquarters, one time he was giving the staff a pretty severe dressing down. Marshall felt obligated to defend the staff and stepped forward and gave some pretty decent lip back to Pershing. Apparently the other folks in the room were pretty stunned, and several of them, I guess afterwards, shook his hand and said, "Nice knowing ya." But the dressing down he gave back to Pershing was about difficulties having, which included that headquarters was not always helpful to American Expeditionary Force headquarters was not always helpful to the 1st Division, and so Pershing remembered that and brought him up to AEF headquarters there. Yes, sir?
Where is he in the photo?
Oh, yes. Marshall is the tall gentleman next to Pershing, just off to his right, this gentleman here. Sorry, I'm not tall, I can't point
Front row.
Yeah, front row, third from the left in that photo. Thank you.
He's actually standing higher than the others. If you look at their feet.
Yes, yes, there's a little piece of wood that he's standing on. But he was fairly tall. He was 6'1", maybe? So as the Assistant Chief of Operations for the U.S. Army, Marshall planned the, please pardon my French, literally, the Cantigny, Saint Mihiel, and Meuse-Argonne operations. For the latter two, Marshall had to transfer 600,000 men and all the accompanying materiel from Saint Mihiel to the Meuse-Argonne front in a very short time. It went smoothly, and others took note. He earned the nickname the Wizard as a result. And I think I can sum this up by saying that prior to World War I, Marshall was a relative unknown within the U.S. Army itself. By its end, he was one of the most highly regarded Army officers. So lessons learned. These are the lessons Marshall learned in World War I. You can see here the best peacetime commanders might not be suited for the battlefield. Best combat officers chafed against the military routines of peacetime. Battlefield conditions demanded officers who were flexible, not who went by the manual. This can be boiled down to, what made a good peacetime commander was not the same as for combat. Combat needed someone flexible who could think on their feet. That was not always rewarded in peacetime. Another lesson, many regular Army officers were not up to the task. Some could not handle the physical demands. Others could not handle the psychological, emotional strain. We see the effects of this later in World War II when Marshall had an unwritten rule of no combat officers older than 55, and when hundreds of senior officers are purged from the Army toward the end of 1941, right before the war starts, and right after the 1941 maneuvers. Patton is the best known of Marshall's exceptions to the 55-year rule. Marshall was a pretty darn good judge of character. He recognized that Patton was probably the best commander for his idea of modern mobile warfare.
Dan, how old was Patton at that point?
Patton was, let's see, I think he was...
Late 50s?
By the time World War II starts, he's about 60, maybe early 60s. I believe he was born in 1879. I think he was a year older than Marshall. Don't hold me to that. Yeah. Other lessons learned, realistic field training was necessary. This was the catalyst for the several 1941 maneuvers. There's one in Louisiana, one in Tennessee, one in the Carolinas. And these maneuvers covered hundreds of square miles. Louisiana maneuvers actually were part of Louisiana and Texas. Carolina maneuvers included both Carolinas and tens of thousands of U.S. troops. Another lesson is even a bad decision. Yes, Bob?
Dan, Patton was 56 and 41.
56? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I knew there was a 6 in there. Another lesson learned is even a bad decision is better than no decision. That irked Marshall to no end. Make a decision. He told Eisenhower at the start of World War I, he brought Eisenhower to the War Plans Division within headquarters and told Eisenhower, all right, here's the situation in the Pacific, what are we going to do? Eisenhower said, give me 3 hours, I believe it was. Took a legal pad, basically made his notes, came back and reported what he thought needed to be done, particularly about the Philippines. And Marshall said, okay, go do it. And he told Eisenhower, this place is full of bright minds who have great ideas but have to constantly come back to me to ask for approval. He said, I want to know what you've done and that it's been accomplished. So not making a decision irked him to no end. And at least you're doing something you can learn from a bad decision. You can't learn from no decision. The most important lesson, however, was coalition warfare. And we'll see this later, of course, in World War II. So after World War I, Marshall serves as aide-de-camp to General John Pershing. This allows him to observe and learn the legislative process. He was in meetings with President, that would have been Harding at the time. So he learned the legislative process as well as monetary policy. Charles Dawes was the first director of the Bureau of the Budget. Bernard Barrick was chair of the War Industries Board. Both were self-made men, millionaires, and they were very instrumental in monetary policy and helped him, learn and understand monetary policy. Dealt with Congress on military matters and learned congressional politics, as well as becoming familiar with a number of congressmen that he would work with later. In his years as chief of staff, he used this experience well to get what the Army needed from Congress. He had a command of detail that, unlike many others, he was honest, forthright with Congress, and earned the respect of many in Congress. They believed him when Marshall told them what the Army needed and generally approved it without question.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Any incidents from his dealings with the British or the French during World War I in particular? You spoke about coalition building.
Yeah, nothing that comes to mind off the top of my
Pershing
head.
took the lead, I assume.
Yes. Fox Connor, which I'll talk about a little bit later, worked with Marshall during World War I, and he had some lessons about coalition warfare that Marshall takes to heart, but I'll get to that in a bit.
Thank you.
So 1924 to 1927, he's in China, learns basic Mandarin. I gotta hand it to him for that. He serves with Vinegar Joe Stilwell. They get to know each other, they become friends. Stilwell is one of the few people who would call him George, rather than General. September 1927, Marshall is appointed an instructor at the Army War College in D.C. As I mentioned earlier, his wife Elizabeth had always had poor health and a heart condition and died literally days after he was appointed. He was heartbroken, moped around. His friends and the chief of staff knew they had to get him out of D.C., and they came up with 3 choices for him. I forget what the other 2 were, but one is as an instructor down at the infantry school at Fort Benning, and he chooses that assignment. There he meets Catherine Tupper Brown, who was a wealthy widow with 3 children. She was ideal for Marshall, I think. She was accomplished in her own right. She was an actress. She had performed with a Shakespeare company in England for about 5 years. Her health did not, she collapsed on stage more than once, and so she had to give that up. Marries a very successful trial lawyer in Baltimore who is murdered by one of his clients who didn't like the result, and that he owed Mr. Brown quite a bit of money as a result. So he meets her at someone's home in Fort Benning, and the story of the night they met is really pretty neat. He offers to drive her home. They're driving around for about an hour and a half, I think, and she says, he was Colonel at the time, said, "Colonel, You seem to not know the area very well. He says, on the contrary, I know the area extremely well. That's why I've been able to avoid your street for the last 90 minutes. But she had money from her first marriage, so money was not an issue. Her children became the children he never had, and Catherine's youngest son, Alan, became his favorite. Sadly, Alan, who was a tank commander, was killed by a sniper during the Anzio campaign. Shortly, not long after the landing, he was riding along in a tank and sitting up at the top so he could get a better view. A German sniper killed him. Marshall visits his grave at Anzio several times, both during the war and after, one time with Catherine. But that relationship gave Marshall a solid foundation. Now, Marshall's years at the infantry school, one of those topics I find fascinating. I think you could give a talk just on this topic alone. No, I'm not volunteering, Steve. But he had complete control of instruction and the curriculum. He assembled a talented group of instructors, many of whom had recent troop experience. Stillwell was one, Omar Bradley was another. He revamped instruction and teaching techniques. For example, Marshall would have students ride for miles, stop, and then make them map the terrain they had just ridden across. Or he would give them deliberately vague or incorrect orders, and they would have to work on the fly and figure things out. He shrank class size and forbade reading lessons. Apparently before his arrival, lessons were simply read, and then students, if the lesson was done before class time ended, students had to stick around and just sit there. Marshall said, no more reading. You're going to tell them what the lesson is, you're going to demonstrate it, and then have the students demonstrate it. And if you get done early, let them go. Exercises were practical. Student initiative was encouraged. Marshall understood new tactics were necessary for modern mobile warfare. So he experimented with new tactics as well as instruction. Tactics were based on Pershing's idea in World War I of firepower and maneuverability. Modern mobile warfare, right? And move, shoot, and communicate was key. Here's what he explained to students. Picture the opening picture the opening campaign of a war. It is a cloud of uncertainties. Congestion on the roads, strange terrain, lack of ammunition and supplies at the right place at the right moment, failures in communication, terrific tests of endurance and misunderstandings in direct proportion to the inexperience of the officers. Add to this a minimum of preliminary information of the enemy, poor maps, and the speed of movement or in alteration of the situation resulting from fast-flying planes, fast-moving tanks, armored cars, and motor transportation in general. There you have warfare of movement, such as swept over Belgium or northern France in 1914. That, gentlemen, is what you are supposed to be preparing for, unquote. In addition, now this didn't occur at Fort Benning, but the ideas that Marshall had as a result of his time at Fort Benning. Army units had been square. By that I mean every unit was composed of 4 separate units. Marshall decided that was too unwieldy, and if I remember correctly, he came up with a commander could effectively control roughly 800 to 1,000 men at most. Marshall was largely responsible for making all units in the Army triangular, consisting of 3 pieces, which made it easier to control and more mobile. For example, a platoon was 3 squads, and then I find this, they're triangular, but it's 3 squads and a heavy weapons unit. A company is 3 platoons and a heavy weapons unit. 3 companies and a heavy weapons unit make up a battalion, and so on. This was applied all the way up to division, later even to armies and army groups. And the tactic that was taught was the holding attack. And so you have 3 units, right? One unit, attacks frontally and holds the enemy in place. A second unit also attacks typically a flanking maneuver. And then you have 1 unit left in reserve, so whichever attack does better, you can reinforce with that third unit. Yes, sir?
I know we've spoken of this before, Dan, but did any Axis unit ever exploit the knowledge of what U.S. Army tactics almost invariably were, taking this 3-way approach?
Not that I have read that.
It was certainly no secret.
No. I don't believe it was. And,
You would
all
think
these
German
things
generals in some dugout at some point said, well, here's what they're going to do, because we know this is the Marshall approach.
Yes, I think U.S. Firepower superiority was so great that it certainly helped. But I have not read of anything where the Army decided, oops, the jig is up. They know what we're going to do, and we can't use that tactic anymore.
Thank you.
Certainly. I think this sums up Marshall's time at the infantry school pretty darn well. Marshall made the infantry school the fountainhead of Army reform, and his students and protégés quietly spread the word. Quote, "We bored from within without cessation during my 5 years at Benning," unquote, according to Marshall, several months after leaving the school, quietly and gradually so as not to arouse opposition to action. And there was quite a bit of opposition to both his teaching methods and the new tactics, all of that. Marshall brought in, as faculty, as I mentioned, open-minded men recently returned from troop duty. He hammered incessantly on the theme of simplicity, no long lectures containing only school-approved doctrine, no exercises dependent upon possessing elaborate maps, no beautifully detailed orders stifling initiative, no overblown intelligence estimates that harried commanders had no time to read, and no field procedures so complex that tired citizen soldiers could not perform them. He said, quote, "Get down to the essentials, make clear the real difficulties, and expunge the bunk, complications, and ponderosities," unquote. Campaigning against the, quote, "colorless, pedantic form," close quote, used in manual writing, he insisted that it be replaced by clear, concise language written to impress National Guard and reserve officers, not just regulars. There were a number of instances in World War I where staff would take all the time to craft these beautifully written and very precise instructions, only that by the time it got transmitted up, the situation was different and the orders no longer were relevant. For success as a commander of citizen soldiers fighting a war of movement, officers needed, quote, "a knowledge of how to operate by means of brief, concise, oral orders based on the ground you can see or on maps with very little detail, a high degree of cleverness, constant tactical readiness, speed of thought, speed of action, and direct and speed of operation." You can, unquote, you can see the emphasis on speed there. These were not commonplace ideas in an era in which most officers were devoted to the minutely detailed, lengthy orders that took so long to work out, but which had brought them such good grades at Leavenworth. That's the command school at the time.
Daniel, question?
Yes?
I hate to comment, but everything you said, for the benefit of everybody else, was being said in German by General Hans von Seeckt, who was the commander of the German army in the 1920s and trying to revise and reform it so it would be ready for the next war. And indeed, everything you just said that Marshall said is in a book that a captain in the German army wrote in the 1930s called, I think his last name was Rommel.
Sounds vaguely familiar.
Rings a bell.
We'll get to him in a little bit, but Major Albert Wedemeyer, whose parents were German, he's first generation American, he goes off, he's one of those bright minds in the Army, he goes off and studies for 3 years with the German army. So I think he brought back at least some of this. Now he was, I don't know what he was major at the beginning of World War II, so I don't know what his rank would have been at the time. He might have only been a captain, so I don't know how influential it was. But you know, those ideas were getting transmitted from one army to another. So the Marshall approach, the first scene at Fort Benning, because that's really the first place where Marshall can establish a decent-sized staff of his own. Recruit a superior staff, give them their assignments, leave them alone. If they hesitate, help buck them up, as he would say. If they fail, relieve them. And that's what he followed through most of the war. There was this common reference to Marshall's Men, this little black book that he had. I don't know if anyone's established that there really was a little black book, but I'm sure Marshall was keeping notes. He had a hell of a memory. He would remember people, but he had a list, whether written down in a book, in his head, of folks who impressed him, one of whom was Eisenhower, Bradley, Stilwell. Those were all some of his Marshall's men. But he taught the next generation of commanders. Some 150 of the students that went through the infantry school while he was there became generals over the next 20 years. As I mentioned, Bradley and Stilwell were instructors. So following Fort Benning, Marshall had a series of commands. I think they impact his later thinking and actions quite a bit. The Civilian Conservation Corps was very much like mobilization for war. By this time, many in the Army, including Marshall, believed that war with Germany was likely, if not inevitable. Marshall's experience with the CCC and the National Guard brought him into contact with the men who would be GIs in World War II. He learned to work with civilians and focused on teaching them the knowledge and skills they needed to get jobs. That knowledge and skills were handy during the war as well. But I think this helped Marshall understand the GI much better and would lead to some of the steps he took later as Chief of Staff. So 1939, Malin Craig is stepping down as Chief of Staff. The Army had a policy that the Chief of Staff would come from the senior officers who could serve a 4-year term that ended before mandatory retirement at age 64. So this left 4 people as candidates, all of whom were 4 in addition to Marshall, all of whom were more senior to him. Anybody recognize any of those names up there? Kruger. Walter Kruger, he's the only one who actually has any kind of combat role in particular in World War II. The others were all over here in the United States.
Dan?
Yes?
In particular,
William.
Kruger ended up being the general who was designated for Operation Olympic, which would have been the land invasion the amphibious invasion of Japan had it come to that.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Thank you. He started in the Mediterranean, Italy, I believe, then went over to, because he commanded at Iwo Jima, if I'm not mistaken. Not Iwo Jima, Okinawa, if I'm not mistaken. Of these 4, Hugh Drum was the most serious contender. He had been considered before when Malin Craig was appointed Chief of Staff. But Drum was a relentless self-promoter. And he had Congress people, others really pushing for him, which turned Roosevelt off. And that pretty much spelled the end for him. Marshall did not campaign for the job. Matter of fact, Harry Hopkins, who was probably Roosevelt's closest advisor, tried to get him to at least tell Roosevelt that he was interested in the job, and Marshall refused. He basically said, "I'll let my work, stand for stand for me. And there's also a story that in a meeting with all of his military advisors, Roosevelt, so it has to be earlier than fall of 39, I think it's maybe March of 39, Roosevelt knows he can't get a whole lot passed Congress budget-wise, so he's thinking 20,000 planes. Congress might approve 20,000 planes because those aren't soldiers, and everybody in the meeting says, great idea. He turns to Marshall, and Marshall says, I hate to say it, Mr. President, but I disagree with that completely. Then went on to say, you can't have just planes, you need airfields, you need people to fly them, you need people to train. Where are we going to get all this stuff? We can't just ask for the planes themselves. Roosevelt remembered that, kind of like Pershing did in World War I. He had somebody who was willing to say no to him, speak his mind when he really thought it necessary. Marshall also had Harry Hopkins pulling for him, and as I said, Hopkins was probably Roosevelt's closest advisor, and so that was enough to save the day.
Question.
So, yes, William.
Could you go back? Who are those three from left to right?
Hugh Drum, DeWitt, and Kruger. I could not find a picture of Frank Powell.
Thank you.
Rowell, right? Rowell? Sorry,
Rowell.
Yes, Rowell. There very little out about him that I could find. Anyway, so yes, there they are.
Thank you.
So, Chief of Staff, Marshall takes the oath as Chief of Staff on September 1, 1939. Recognize the date, anyone? That's the invasion of Poland.
All the time.
So, his appointment as Chief of Staff really flies under the radar there. His only condition was that he had the right to speak his mind to President Roosevelt. Roosevelt agreed. Marshall did his best to ensure the relationship was purely professional. He never accepted an invitation to one of Roosevelt's residences. He would not laugh at his jokes or let Roosevelt call him George. There were a few times it did. Once early on, Roosevelt called him George. Marshall rather abruptly got up and left. So in 1939, the U.S. Army ranks 17th in the world, ahead of Bulgaria and after Portugal in size, about 175,000. It grew to 1.5 million by the end of 1941. Marshall oversees that. The 1941 maneuvers accomplished two important ends in my book. One was it allowed the Army to practice its new mobility and tactics, although they had nowhere near the tanks, half-tracks. They did have quite a few trucks, so what they would do is paint on the canvas, tank. Sometimes they would put a log in it to replicate a gun, and during the maneuvers those would serve as tanks. But it also showed that some officers were not up to snuff. The lesson from World War I, right? About peacetime officers not being able to handle combat. Even though this was not combat, it was still pretty stressful. So Marshall purged hundreds of senior officers, made some enemies in doing so. It's interesting to note that later in the war, after the war, Marshall starts getting some criticism, but a lot of it comes from those senior officers who were replaced by him. The purge did show the ordinary soldier, though, that the Army was serious about getting rid of poor officers. The officer candidate school's another idea of Marshall's, and I think it shows that quintessential American idea of fairness. Ability is what's going to get you, not status, not class, not birth. Commanders recommended candidates. The OCS trained 150,000 new junior officers each year to the end of the war. Omar Bradley thought the OCS was Marshall's greatest contribution to mobilization. Marshall was not shy about using the press, radio, and Hollywood, either as a training tool or to get what the Army needed. Anybody familiar with the Why We Fight series of films? 7 films directed by, anybody know who directed them?
Capra?
Frank Capra. But those replaced lectures that were given to new recruits as to why the U.S. was in a war. Marshall gave periodic radio addresses on the status of the Army, what it needed. He held press conferences. The USO idea arose from Marshall's idea that soldiers should have adequate creature comforts and avoid boredom. It resulted from a surprise visit that Marshall made in civilian clothes to a small southern town, inundated by soldiers on leave one weekend. They had to wait literally hours for a rather inadequate meal at the 1 or 2 restaurants in town, and so Marshall decided, we need to come up with some way of giving soldiers a way out of their boredom, and get them a hot cup of coffee, a decent meal. The America First Committee, anybody familiar with that? It's the isolationism movement. Forget his name, but the guy.
Lindbergh's one who was real prominent.
He was, so was Father Coughlin, Charles Coughlin, but the guy who was the head of Sears Roebuck at the time was a primary mover. There were some big business people who were behind this and wanted to keep the U.S. out of World War II. I believe Marshall does not get nearly enough credit for fighting the America First Committee and isolation. And isolationism. Could be another topic, Steve. Again, I'm not volunteering. Marshall's recent experience with the CCC and National Guard helped him understand the typical American soldier. Griping was common, almost considered a God-given right. He let him gripe, and he would listen to him. He responded to letters from soldiers and their families about problems or gripes. Thanks, William, but remember the scene from Saving Private Ryan? The letter scene? That was not uncommon. He would answer some 20 letters a day, personally, if not handwriting, at least some of them, he would dictate them. During the war, even though Marshall was only one of the chiefs of the armed forces, he was clearly the senior officer of the American High Command and became Roosevelt's most trusted military advisor. Admiral King, General Hap Arnold, Admiral Leahy deferred to him. As Steve mentioned, I think more than any other officer, Marshall modernized the U.S. Army. Think about this. From the time he's appointed, September 1, 1939, to the end of World War II, it's less than 5 years. He totally revamped the Army, tactics, thinking in that span of time. It just amazes me what he accomplished in that amount of time. The Victory Program, Major Albert Wedemeyer. We talked about him a little bit earlier. So, Wedemeyer's asked, okay, what kind of manpower are we going to need to win World War II? His research shows that most nations mobilized at best 10% of their adult population. At the time, the U.S. has 135 million, 13.5 million. That's assuming you can move enough women into defense work. So 8% is a reasonable goal. That gets you to 10.8 million. 2 million for the Navy and the Marines, that leaves the Army 8.8 million. That includes the Army Air Force at the time. The original idea was 215 divisions. In the end, they only had 91. They were originally shooting, I think, for 108 replacements. A bunch of other things got in the way, because the standard division at the time was 12,000, I believe. You divide 8.8 million into 12,000, you come up with some number of 400. But you need all the, all the people not on the battlefield. You need supply. right? You need training of folks back here. You need people to to man the bases. All of that stuff. Oh shoot! I just had a thought I wanted to add from another book. Oh, there's a war to be won, not to be confused with a war to be won. This is about building the American Army. And J.C.H. Lee, a descendant of Robert E. Lee, who thought so highly of himself that people came to call him JCH stood for Jesus Christ Himself Lee. He was in command of the quartermaster, and the quartermaster was responsible for testing everybody who came into the army and see where they should fall. So some go to intelligence, some go to all this and that. Well, Lee was siphoning off all the best and brightest for the Quartermaster Corps. And toward the end of the war, the U.S. replacement system was kind of a mess. But toward the end of the war, when things were getting a little desperate, they started siphoning off all these quartermaster folks and sending them up to the front lines. And combat officers were going, "Oh my God, these guys are smart." Anyway, a little anecdote that has really nothing to do with this, but I thought it was rather interesting. I think that's where I get the 108 divisions, though. Anyway, I digress. So Major Albert Wedemeyer was one of those keen minds that Marshall found and used to great advantage. But the program also included war production, what the U.S. needed. Anything in excess of that was sent off to the Allies, Great Britain, Russia primarily. So coalition warfare was the greatest lesson Marshall took from World War I. He served under Fox Connor, World War I. Connor's 3 principles of war for a democracy were: never fight unless you have to, never fight alone, and never fight for long. In a democracy, will of the people only lasts so long, right? So there are several key instances showing Marshall's understanding of coalition warfare, both within the Allies and within the U.S. military itself. 1942, I forget which meeting it was between the U.S. and the British, Tobruk Falls. And there's disagreement between the Allies at the time whether they should invade North Africa in 1942 or Europe in 1943. The Americans were pushing for France in 1943. The British were pushing for North Africa in 1942. Marshall immediately offered to send the 2nd Armored Division to Egypt. Churchill declined, but he appreciated the offer. This really would have hurt the U.S. buildup in England, but it helped cement the alliance with Britain. Churchill, I think, understood the U.S. would defer to the British if necessary. It wasn't just America first. There's another example that I find rather humorous. Early on, Admiral King feels slighted because he's made to wait outside Marshall's office for a while Marshall ends a previous meeting. Admiral King, if anyone knows the personality, not surprised. He walks off in a huff, goes back to his office. Marshall comes out of his office when the meeting's over, learns what happened, goes to Admiral King and apologizes. And I think both those examples show that Marshall understood the overall need to work and fight together. He was not above apologizing and finding a way to work with others. I mean, can you imagine Admiral King doing the same if the shoes were reversed? I can't. Marshall was a proponent of the Germany First strategy, but the British disagreed with how to accomplish Germany's defeat. In many ways, Great Britain was still dealing with World War I. So in World War II, the British pretty much refused to fight pitched battles where casualties would be high, such as happened in World War I, unless it had overwhelming superiority. I think this helps explain Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery's tactics quite a bit. Yes, sir?
I don't understand the term pitched battles.
Pitch battle, basically where you just go in and fight. You don't try a flank attack. You don't try another landing elsewhere, something like that. That you just go in and fight tooth and nail with the other side, head to head. Yes. I think you have to remember Great Britain lost an entire generation in World War I, and particularly at the Battle of the Somme, where it suffered over 400,000 casualties with almost 100,000 killed in a matter of months.
Confident generals, that's very confident.
You have no argument for me. It also helps explain, I think, Churchill's constant desire to what Marshall referred to as pinprick Hitler to death. Kept proposing an invasion of the Balkans, the soft underbelly of Europe, which was strategically and tactically unsound. It's mountainous territory. You could easily get bottled up. It's not the place where you're going to fight, modern mobile warfare, right? It's not good tank ground. Northern France is good tank ground. He proposed invading Rhodes. These suggestions infuriated Marshall. It was almost as if Churchill was trying to prove that Gallipoli was not a mistake. Even after Churchill agreed to the invasion of France, Marshall had to hold his feet to the fire a few times. Marshall threatened more than once to pull back from the Germany First strategy and focus on the Pacific theater. I mean, after all, most Americans considered Japan the real enemy, right? They're the ones who attacked. Germany just declared war because they were an ally. And so everybody, most Americans thought Japan was the primary enemy and we should focus on them. Marshall also had to fight within the U.S. military against mistrust of the British, both as to their goals and to their fighting ability. The British, at least initially, through North Africa, certainly, even toward the end of the war, the British thought the Americans knew nothing about how to fight the Germans. They knew how to fight the Germans. But when you think about it, how much offensive warfare did the British engage in the early part of World War I, by themselves? Other than in Egypt, very little.
World War II.
World War II, yes, thank you. My ones and twos, or my WWs mixed up. The Americans were also very suspicious of British goals, particularly in the Mediterranean. The Americans thought that the British their strategy was based on retaining and regaining its empire. So we had to fight that.
Question, Dan?
Yes, sir.
Obviously, the Pearl Harbor attack.
You're getting to your limit.
I'm sorry. I'll wait till later then.
Go right ahead.
Obviously, Pearl Harbor, the attack was primarily naval aviation, and to a much lesser extent submarines, but it had a land component, of course, the Philippines following closely thereafter. Do you think Marshall bears any responsibility for how badly surprised the U.S. was?
Well, he has to as chief of staff, I think, but, and this has been examined more than once, there were some warnings, vague though they might have been, to Kimmel and Short in Hawaii that they pretty much ignored. So while he has some responsibility to hammer it into them, hey, be aware of this. In the end, it's Kimmel and Short's responsibility primarily, I think.
And MacArthur in the Philippines.
Yes, MacArthur in the Philippines probably even more so than Short and Kimmel, because he knew about Pearl Harbor and was told and did nothing. He didn't move his planes, so the Japanese came in and took out a lot of B-17s that had been flown to him just recently, for his purposes. That is probably, I used to be, in my younger days, a big fan of MacArthur. The more I read about him, the less of a fan I am.
In that you are wise.
Yeah, I know. But that part of MacArthur's career, I think, is probably his worst, the Philippines. He performed terribly, didn't properly plan. Even when he knew that things were coming, he didn't take adequate action, and he left. Oh shoot, who was it?
Wainwright?
Wainwright, yeah, left poor Wainwright high and dry. Oh, he was ordered out, but still, he left him high and dry on Bataan when he was at Corregidor. Anyway, the talk you're going to get about Marshall in Japan from 1945 to 50, I think that's the most brilliant part of MacArthur's career. But on we go. Okay, Marshall was a pretty good judge of others, I think. With the Russians, he concluded pretty quickly that they liked blunt talk and even profanity, and so he adopted, that approach. Particularly with Stalin. Stalin liked it. Stalin thought Marshall was great. There's an early meeting where Marshall would say something. It would be interpreted by the Russian interpreter. He would ask his interpreter, did that guy interpret what I said properly? And his interpreter would say, no, not really. I said, well, tell him to repeat it as I said. And so the Russian interpreters would say it again. He asked his interpreter, did he do it? And he said, no, he didn't do it again. And so he said, tell him to interpret word for word what I said, and he finally did. I think that impressed Stalin. As the war goes on and Roosevelt weakens, Marshall becomes even more responsible for the war. Generally, Marshall did his best, at least early on, to focus on military matters only, not the political. Even if the military issue implicated political questions, he would defer to Roosevelt to decide those. But as Roosevelt weakened, Marshall became responsible for more of that, even when there were political ramifications. So World War II ends, we won.
Yay.
And Marshall resigns pretty quickly as Chief of Staff on November 18, 1945. A week later, Truman appoints him as Special Ambassadorial Envoy to China. His experience in China in the 20s certainly was a factor. His familiarity with at least some Mandarin helped. He achieved some success, but the problem was Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai did not trust Chiang Kai-shek and vice versa, and they would agree to things and then immediately, it would fall apart. Marshall later concluded he failed because he tried to please everyone, and that does affect some of his thinking later. January 1947, he's appointed Secretary of State, and he immediately is faced with several crises. First, Great Britain had been funding the Greek monarchy and the Greek government since the end of World War I and was out of money. Told the Americans, can't do it anymore. Turkey also needed money for its military and economic development. Both were fighting communist insurgents, although it was more dire in Greece than in Turkey. So the U.S. provided, Marshall was instrumental in getting it $400 million for both of those countries. That is the beginning, the seeds of the Marshall Plan and the containment strategy. At the Moscow Foreign Ministers meeting in March, Marshall concludes Soviet Union is not going to live up to any of its promises from the war and wants Europe to fail. And So Marshall also sends a mission to Europe, and it reported back that Europe was nearing collapse and communists could be elected in several places, including Italy and France. And then less than a year later, in April 1948, $13 billion was passed. This is the Marshall Plan. Though the plan itself was not his idea, George Kennan was prominent in the plan itself. At least the germ of the idea was Marshall's. We've got to do something to help shore up Europe or for our defense purposes, or we're going to have another war to fight. One aspect of the Marshall Plan that most forget, including me, was that it was offered to all of Europe, not just what wasn't the Soviet bloc. The USSR refused to participate and even blocked requests from Poland and Romania for aid. Marshall had insisted that the plan be offered to all, and the USSR be the one that refused the aid, not the US refusing to offer it. Marshall thought Europe was already divided enough. We don't want to divide it any further by offering it only to some countries and not others. So the Marshall Plan is announced at the 1947 Harvard commencement speech. Marshall was not even the primary speaker. He insisted that it not be. No one was informed it would be an important speech, although it wasn't written by him. It is pretty typical of him. It's short and direct. It's 7 double-spaced typed pages. You can read it and listen to a recording of Marshall delivering it on the Marshall Foundation website, which is fabulous, by the way. This is a major address. It's not quite 11 minutes long. It's like 10 minutes, 50 seconds. But the Marshall Plan is a European plan funded by the US. Europe would tell us what they needed. We'd give them the money, or the food, or the goods. All countries could participate. Help would be for a specified time. Again, in a democracy, don't fight for too long. The will of the voters is only going to last so long. Once the immediate physical need of people was met, that is food, the focus would then be on rebuilding infrastructure. And then all participants had to trade equally with each other. 16 European countries outlined their needs and submitted them to the US. Truman is the one who suggested calling it the Marshall Plan, not the Truman Plan. He figured Marshall's reputation for integrity and being nonpartisan would ensure its passage more than if his name were tied to it. Arthur Vandenberg, U.S. Senator from Michigan, was instrumental in getting it passed in April 1948. So that's the Marshall Plan. Now, NATO. During World War II, Marshall had thought about how to preserve the peace after the war and prevent another one. In a speech to the Academy of Political Science in 1942, he discussed the question of preventing future world wars. This was the germ of NATO, at least to me. At the London Foreign Ministers meeting in 1947, Marshall suggested to Great Britain and France, look, measure up all your defense needs. Let us know, what you've got. Here's your assets, here's your liabilities. We'll make up the difference. And he encouraged Great Britain, France, and the Benelux countries to form an alliance, and NATO was born. The Berlin airlift was shortly after. Marshall recognized that the Soviets preferred political action, not military, and that they would not interfere with the airlift. Marshall also participated in creating the Organization of American States from the Pan American Union. Israel's recognition is one of those areas I'll talk about a little bit later. First, Marshall looked at it from strictly a U.S. viewpoint, said, why would we do that? But then he turned around and realized there are moments in history when you have to look beyond your own interests, and this was one. He sent this note to Truman, quote, "It seems to me in my relationship to you that invariably we have tried to do what we have tried to do has been without selfish national prejudices and for the general good of people all over the world." So he retired as Secretary of State in January 1947. So 49, I'm sorry. So 47, 49, 2 years he accomplished all that. That's the beginning of Truman's second term. It was not coincidental that that's the timing. He becomes president of the Red Cross, which was dominated by East Coast people. Morale was poor. He worked to democratize it, get more involvement from the locals, and raising morale. The Battlefield Monuments Commission was Pershing's before him, and he loved being on that. So Secretary of Defense. At the end of World War II, Marshall proposes the Department of Defense. Get everybody under one umbrella so you don't have all this inter-service fighting. Worked somewhat, not all. He's secretary for a little over a year, finalizes the treaty with Japan, helped convince France to rearm Germany for NATO. He helped get the defense budget increased, helps pass the Universal Military Training and Service Act, registering for the draft, wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953. Like it how I put that last on the list. This anecdote, I think, tells you a lot about the man. When Truman asked Marshall to be Secretary of Defense, he did so to help with Korea, and MacArthur in particular. Dean Acheson was Secretary of State and had worked for Marshall when Marshall was Secretary. And Acheson thought that Marshall should be deferred to after Truman. Marshall would have none of it. By protocol, Secretary of State is senior, and Marshall deferred to Acheson. I just don't like what that says about him. In the 50s, Marshall's health declines. By 1957, he had begun losing his hearing, his balance was off, he was on lots of medications, his weight was down to 150 from about 180 to 200. He was back to his playing weight, but he fell and broke a hip. He was bedridden a lot in 1958. 1959, he suffered strokes in January and February. He rebounded a little bit, but gets weaker over time. He eventually loses his sight, his hearing, and speech, falls into a coma. Churchill comes with Eisenhower to visit him at Walter Reed, and Churchill can't even enter the room. He just stands in the doorway with tears in his eyes. And he died at 6:08 p.m. on Friday, October 16, 1959. He's buried in Arlington. That's his gravestone, headstone. So let's talk about Marshall the man. Reserved, formal, correct, austere, private, selfless, dedicated, self-disciplined, and stoic have all been used to describe him. They're all accurate, at least to an extent. He called only a few by their first names. It was always Eisenhower, never Ike. And that was it, just Eisenhower. Not ranked, just the last name. He asked the president to call him General, and bridled the few times he called him George. He had a command of details. There's a story about a press conference in Algiers after the North Africa landings. Marshall gets up to speak. There's some 60 reporters in the room, and he asks each of them to give him a question. And he goes around the room, 60 questions, something like that. In his 40-minute response, he answered every question, and he looked at the individual reporter who asked the question when he was answering it. That's the kind of detail, command of detail he had. He was selfless and dedicated. There's no question. He had integrity and a sense of honor. He followed the military tradition of never voting. He was humble. He was a shrewd judge of character, though he rarely complimented others, at least until their working relationship was over. Dean Rusk told about when he was an assistant in the State Department at a meeting of the UN in Paris in September 1948. Rusk drafted a reply to a cable from Marshall. Marshall told him, Rusk, quote, Rusk, there are times when I think you are earning your pay, unquote. Rusk considered that high praise. Marshall, and that was. You very seldom got a good job from him. But I think that story also shows his sense of humor. He often said his mother was a Democrat, his father was a Republican, and he was an Episcopalian. He was never a martinet. No one better separated military and civilian roles. He was offered a lot of money to write his memoirs after the war, but he refused, said, my experiences belong to the American people. And similar to Truman when he was being asked to be on all these boards after he was president. Here's some telling quotes about Marshall. Stimson was the Secretary of War during the war and had served in the Army as a colonel during World War I. On VE Day, concluding his address to the U.S. High Command, he said to Marshall, quote, "I have seen a great many soldiers in my lifetime, and you, sir, are the finest soldier I have ever known," unquote. I think Stimson had something of a bromance for Marshall. They really respected each other. Their offices were right next to each other. Churchill's quote here is after Marshall drafted the communique to Stalin following the Trident meeting. He summed up everything very well, covered all the topics, and did so in briefly, as Marshall would have wanted anyone else to do. A number of quite important people thought Marshall was the key to winning World War II. Churchill said he was the organizer of the victory. Stalin openly admired him. He was a good general, Stalin said. It was high praise coming from him. So Marshall's failures. Everybody has some. I think the first one is issue of segregation in the Army, which Marshall simply ignored. And you can argue that there were a lot of other things going on, that this was not a primary issue, but Marshall dealt with a lot of details and a lot of less important issues than this. He simply ignored segregation within the service. During McCarthyism, the rise of McCarthyism, early on, he provided information to the Senate on Department of Defense employees. I think he regretted that later on. As I mentioned earlier, he initially regretted or argued against recognizing Israel. To his credit, he realized that was a mistake. So other thoughts. Many have thought that Marshall would have replaced Eisenhower. Eisenhower was placed in command of the landings in North Africa, then in the Mediterranean. A lot of people thought Marshall would be put in charge of the invasion of France, and Eisenhower would then be brought back as chief of staff in Washington. Yeah, I think that was both impractical because of command and rank issues, as well as improbable. Marshall was the obvious choice to continue as chief of staff. Roosevelt recognized that, but Eisenhower couldn't fill Marshall's shoes in D.C. Marshall had excellent relationships, with Congress, knew the political process. Eisenhower did not. Marshall had good relationships with Hap Arnold and Ernest King. Marshall had become the acknowledged leader of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was the first among equals. Eisenhower would merely be an equal, and that would not bode well for decision-making, I think. Marshall was familiar only with Europe, not the Pacific, and certainly not India, China, Burma. Marshall had the global vision and the personal reputation to keep headstrong leaders such as MacArthur and Stilwell in line. I don't think Eisenhower would have been nearly as effective in dealing with MacArthur. I remember Eisenhower was MacArthur's aide in the Philippines, and I can't imagine MacArthur not seeing Eisenhower still as his inferior, both in rank and in ego.
Also during the Bonus Army March, when he was chief of staff here in the U.S.
Yes, yes. Now, give me 1 second, Bob. Finish the thought. MacArthur was chief of...
I didn't hear.
Oh,
Eisenhower was also MacArthur's aide when MacArthur was Army Chief of Staff during the Bonus Army March, for instance, when he sent troops against the Bonus Army marchers against President Hoover's orders.
yes. And Well, go ahead, Bob, because I lost my thought.
Yes, I was going to
No
say,
problem.
the Roosevelt